Now that we've gone through the Yuan dynasty, Ogadid Khanate, and Chagatai Khanate, our attention comes to the other Mongol Khanate ruled by the descendants of Qho'Oğei, the Ilkhanate. Ruling Iran, Iraq, the Caucasus, and the Anatolian Peninsula to the borders of the Byzantine Empire, the Ilkhanate was among the most powerful and also perhaps the best understood of the Khanates, due to a wonderful surviving library of historical records, best exemplified by the mammoth universal history, the Ilkhanate's vizier, Rashid al-Din. For our first episode on the Ilkhanate, we look at its establishment by Qho'Oğei and his son Abaka, the first 20 years of the Ilkhanate's history, which did much to define the final 50 years. I'm your host David, and this is Kings and Generals, Ages of Conquest. As a brief aside, you can revisit a two-part discussion between our series historian, Jack Wilson, with Professor Michael Hope, a specialist on the Ilkhanate, which we have uploaded on all sites that host our podcast. We last left off with the Ilkhanate in episode 33 of our main series on the Berke-Qho'Oğei War, where Qho'Oğei fought with his cousin Berke of the Golden Horde over the Caucasus in the early 1260s. Qho'Oğei was the younger brother of Great Khan Möngke and Kublai. The third son of Qho'Oğei, they were grandsons of Chinggis Khan and thus of prestigious lineage. As we saw in episodes 28 and 29, Qho'Oğei had been ordered by his brother Möngke in the 1250s to complete the conquest of southwestern Asia. Despite the claims of some Ilkhanate writers or of modern historians who write of Kublai and Qho'Oğei being made viceroys of China and Western Asia respectively, it is highly unlikely Möngke had commissioned Qho'Oğei to found a new Khanate. Rather, his role was almost certainly just a limited military one, assigned by his brother to complete the conquest so that the Middle East could be properly incorporated into the central governmental structure, or even territory that belonged directly to the Khan. Given Möngke's crackdown on the independence of the Ogadids, Chagatayids, and to a lesser extent the Jochids, it seems unlikely he was setting up a vast area to become personal fief to either another member of the family, even if it was his younger brother. Certainly, we can't also ignore statements that this was land Chinggis Khan had granted specifically to the Tuluids, or that the Ilkhanate emerged from a division of the empire following Chinggis's death in 1227. The conquest of Iran proper did not begin until after Chinggis's death, and it took until Qho'Oğei in the 1250s for the Middle East to become territory of the House of Qho'Oğei. In fact, it seems much of this territory was considered, up until 1260 or so, as belonging to the House of Jochi. At least the Jochids considered this to be the case. Whatever Möngke's intentions, as with so much, his plans were upset by his death on campaign in 1259. Qho'Oğei was an important commander during Möngke's lifetime, but not necessarily one about to be appointed a long-term governor. Though he had greatly expanded the Mongol Empire westwards and taken Baghdad, the territory that became the Ilkhanate was divided between Jochids in the north, especially in the Caucasus and northern Iran, but also scattered throughout the region. Some Chagatayid territory in the east, namely in parts of Khorasan, the territory that belonged directly to the Great Khan, for whom it seemed Qho'Oğei's conquests would all go to. Following Möngke's death, Qho'Oğei essentially seized all these lands. Whether Qho'Oğei had done this in order to declare his independence, or to take advantage of a primary lapse in imperial authority and then force Möngke's successor to recognize his gains, over 1260 Qho'Oğei seized control of territory claimed by the Jochids and other branches of the family. The Jochid Khan Berke was particularly angered at the loss of the pastures and trade cities of the Caucasus, which Möngke had only shortly before reconfirmed for him. Qho'Oğei did not return east to take part in the election of Möngke's successor or observe matters there, but thought of himself first, using the lull to enrich himself. It was this which precipitated war between the Jochids under Berke in 1262 over the Caucasus. As we addressed briefly in episode 30, it seems that following the sack of Baghdad in 1258, Hulagu began using the title of Ilkhan. While popularly translated as Viceroy or Subject Khan, the more recent scholarship has demonstrated that the title bore no such connotations of submission or subservience. Rather, it simply designated a sovereign in his own right. Most of the uses of the term Ilkhan reflect this usage in the historical sources, with rulers from Chinggis Khan himself to the Khans of the Golden Horde referred to as Ilkhan. By the start of the 1260s, we can speak in earnest of Hulagu and his successors as the Ilkhans. We should expect that to contemporaries, Hulagu was understood as his own monarch in truth, whatever nominal allegiance he and his successors paid to Kublai Khan and his heirs. From 1262 until his death of epilepsy in 1265, Hulagu was largely concerned with battling Berke Khan in Azerbaijan and Georgia in 3 years of on and off warfare. He made excuses to avoid traveling east to confirm Kublai's enthronement as Grand Khan after Arakboke's death. Between fighting the Jochids, Hulagu also had to clamp down on revolts and build a new administration. A number of local leaders in northern Iraq and western Iran who had already submitted to the Mongols revolted after the sack of Baghdad or the defeat at Ain Jalut. All those who revolted were subjected to horrific punishments. The ruler of Mosul, Badruddin Lulu, died in 1261, aged 96, and his son Malik Shah revolted. Hulagu sent an army which brought the city to slaughter and rape the following year, and Malik Shah was tied to a post and covered in sheep's fat, which soon attracted flies. The resulting maggots born from their eggs then ate the poor man alive while he died of exposure in the Iraqi sun. Malik Shah's 3-year-old son was cut in half and left hanging as a warning. Another revolting ruler in Muzaffar Khan, upon being caught by the Mongols, had pieces of his flesh cut off and stuffed into his mouth until he died. In Fars, the Salgurid Atabeg's actions brought the response of a Mongol army. It took until 1264 for the Atabeg to be caught and killed, and a cousin of his married to one of Hulagu's sons. Hulagu also began the building of his own imperial government. He did not merely co-opt the existing Mongol bureaucracy. Much of Hulagu's territory had been previously overseen by the Mongol bureaucrat Arghun Aka, the head of the Secretariat for Iran and Western Asia since the 1240s, first appointed to the post by Qho'Oğei Khatun. While most of Arghun Aka's territorial jurisdiction was brought into Hulagu's new state, and Arghun Aka continued to serve the Ilkhans until his death in 1275, Hulagu had to incorporate territory he himself had only recently conquered. He was strongly influenced by traditional Persian forms of government, due in part to the advice of prominent Persians in his retinue, Nasir al-Din Tusi and the Juivani brothers. The older, Shams al-Din Juivani, was made Hulagu's vizier, a position he would hold for the next 20 or so years. The younger Juivani brother we have met often over the course of this series. Ala al-Din Ata Malik Juivani served in Hulagu's court during his campaigns against the Nizari Ismailis and Baghdad, and in turn, Ala al-Din was appointed to oversee Baghdad's reconstruction. We of course know him best as the author of The History of the World Conqueror, one of the single most important surviving historical sources on the Mongol Empire, and used as a source by other medieval authors like Rashid al-Din. Both Juivani brothers were tasked with much of the rebuilding of the Iranian, Iraqi, Caucasian, and Anatolian cities and their economies, which they approached diligently. It was not without Mongol custom, though, for Hulagu's various sons, wives, and lords were allotted territories to oversee in order to support themselves, the appanage system which so often stymied efforts by the central government to exert its powers. In addition, Hulagu established Maraga in northwestern Iran as his capital, and under the supervision of the brilliant scholar Nasir al-Din Tusi, began to make it a center of learning and science. On Hulagu's order, Tusi built a great observatory there, and Qho'Oğei provided pensions to artists and scholars in order to enhance his reputation. Though Qho'Oğei tended to show greater interest in alchemists, who sought to turn things into gold for him. Additionally, Qho'Oğei ordered the construction of palaces and temples and a number of other public works projects, for, according to Rashid al-Din, Qho'Oğei loved to build. In Rashid's time some 40 years later, a number of Qho'Oğei's projects still stood. Qho'Oğei did not abandon nomadism, and instead, in a model followed by his successors, established a primary capital to house his treasury and governmental apparatus, a place on occasion visited by Qho'Oğei, while Qho'Oğei himself would spend most of his time with his herds and families in his pastures, generally in the rich, cooler pastures of Azerbaijan and northwestern Iran in the summer, and then to eastern Anatolia, northern Iraq, or even Baghdad itself during the winters. Of course, there's also the matter of the Mamluks. The Mamluk Sultanate famously defeated a Mongol army under Ketbuka Noyan at Ain Jalut in September 1260. Qho'Oğei did not see the matter as finished. Before even the end of 1260, another small Mongol army invaded Syria, though it too was quickly defeated. This proved to be the final Mongol incursion into Syria for the 1260s. The borders with the Golden Horde in the Caucasus, the Kara-Una, and the Chagatai Khanate in Khorasan proved of greater concern. Only once other matters were settled would the Ilkhans be able to bring their attention to Syria and the Mamluks, but that war we will cover in a following episode. Qho'Oğei died in February 1265, a complication from the epilepsy he seemed to suffer from. He was buried on an island in the Caspian Sea with considerable treasure and, apparently, human sacrifices. He was followed to the grave soon after by his chief wife, Dokuz Khatun. Aside from an aborted attempt by one son, Yoshmut, to throw his name in for the throne, apparently it was unanimously agreed by the nobles of the Ilkhanate to elect Qho'Oğei's oldest son, Abaka. Abaka may not have been born of Qho'Oğei's chief wives, but he was the most senior of Qho'Oğei's children in the Ilkhanate, since most of Qho'Oğei's sons and wives were still in Mongolia at the time of his death. Abaka had risen as his father's right hand and had overseen the Ilkhanate's eastern Iranian and Khorasani territory. During the initial rounds of fighting against Berke Khan in the Caucasus, Abaka had a key command role, though led his own forces into a humiliating defeat. For the nearly 17 years that Abaka ruled over the Ilkhanate, he proved to be a steady and stabilizing, if unimaginative, monarch. Like his father, he was a capable enough manager, though often had little care for the details of running the state. He shared his father's personal affection for Buddhism, but also continued his policy of general religious tolerance. While Buddhist temples were constructed, Abaka showed himself a friend to all religions. To Christians, Abaka courted alliances with Catholic Europe and Eastern Christian, that is, Nestorian, churches and representatives such as Rabban Bar Sama and Mar Yabalaha were patronized. One of Abaka's wives was a daughter of the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII, named Maria, but called Despina Hatun by the Mongols. The Christian kingdom of Cilician Armenia was a favored ally, and the churches in Greater Armenia, Georgia, and the few Crusader holdouts on the coast were treated respectfully enough. The Armenians and Georgian sources treated Qho'Oğei's wife, the Christian Dokuz Hatun, as a saintly figure who protected and patronized their churches, a second coming of Constantine I and his mother Helene. To Mongols, he ensured the respect of the Yasa of Chinggis Khan and still favored the Mongol elite and military. For Muslims, Abaka relied on traditional Persian governmental institutions, and his top members of the bureaucracy, especially the Jivani brothers, were Muslims. Dokuz Khatun, despite her Christianity, had also showed patronage to Buddhist and Muslim public sites and places of worship. The prominence of the minority Christians and Buddhists in the Ilkhanate's administration and privileges were, however, a matter of contention for an empire with a Muslim-majority population already unhappy to be ruled over by infidels. Abaka's initial steps on his enthronement were to reconfirm the laws passed by his father and to keep most of his appointees in their offices. Shams al-Din Joivani was maintained as vizier and Sahib Diwan, while his brother Ala al-Din Ata Malik was retained in Baghdad. Perhaps the greatest change in Abaka's early days was moving the capital from Maraga to Tabriz and appointing his brothers to the frontiers. Abaka's early reign was caught up with the matter of dealing with his Mongolian kinsmen. Only weeks after his enthronement, Berke Khan and his commander Nogai unleashed another invasion on the Caucasus. You can revisit that war in more detail in episode 33, but after some inconclusive fighting, Berke Khan died of illness en route to Tbilisi in 1266. The force of the Jochids withdrew to select Berke's successor, and Abaka in turn built a wall and deep ditch along the Kura River, the frontier between them in the Ilkhanate. Manned by Mongols and Muslims, we are told it allowed merchants to travel between the Ilkhanate and Golden Horde, but stood strong enough to dissuade any serious Jochid re-offensives for many years. At the end of the 1260s, Abaka then had to deal with the Chagatais. As looked at in episode 47 on the Chagatai Khanate, a peace agreement was reached around 1268 between the Chagatai Khan Barak and Ogadid Prince Kaidu and the new Khan of the Golden Horde, Malke Temur. They agreed to a joint invasion of the Ilkhanate. Barak encouraged the revolt of a Chagatai prince in the Ilkhanate, then followed up with an invasion in 1270. As we covered in detail in episode 47, Abaka successfully had the revolting Chagatai prince captured and defeated Barak at the Battle of Herat in July 1270. Barak was broken and fled back to the Chagatai Khanate, where he died in 1271, which precipitated Kaidu's rise to prominence over the Chagatais. 2 years later, in 1273, Abaka sent a large army to devastate one of the Chagatai Khanate's chief cities, Bukhara, a rather clear message. Kaidu recognized the display of Abaka's power, and despite occasional border raids, the Chagatais would not threaten serious invasion of the Ilkhanate until the early 14th century during the reign of Esenboka Khan, seen in our second episode on the Chagatai Khanate. So clear was Abaka's victory over Barak that shortly afterwards, Malke Temur Khan of the Golden Horde sent gifts and peace offerings to Abaka. Despite raids by the Neguderis or Karunas, Mongol troops stationed in Afghanistan who had gone renegade, Abaka for the rest of his reign had relatively calm relations with the Golden Horde and Chagatais. Following the Battle of Herat, envoys came from Kublai Khan bearing a Yarglik, a decree which confirmed Abaka as Khan. With this confirmation, Abaka was enthroned a second time, and according to Rashid al-Din, only then began to sit in thrones and wear his crown. So began a particular custom of the Ilkhans, in that they would have two enthronements. The first upon their initial election as Khan of the Ilkhanate, and the second following the arrival of an official decree from the Great Khan in China, which confirmed the decision. This, in many respects, was the extent of the Ilkhan's submission to the Great Khans. While maintaining trade and diplomatic ties, the Great Khan could only confirm an election made in the Ilkhanate and had no power to remove him from his office. Still, it remained a source of legitimacy and of adherence to the idea of a unified Mongol empire, even if such a thing no longer existed. After a busy late 1260s, Abaka slowed down in his operations in the 1270s. Much of his time was spent drinking or hunting, something he particularly loved, even if his timing and luck during hunting trips was not always great. Shortly after his first enthronement in 1265, his brother Yoshmut misfired an arrow that grazed Abaka's neck. After his second enthronement in November 1270, Abaka received a grievous wound to his hand from a bison. Though the bleeding was halted with an impromptu tourniquet from a bowstring, the wound developed an abscess and became infected. In immense pain, Abaka's physicians were reluctant to open up the abscess until convinced by Nasir al-Din Tusi that the procedure could be done. Under his supervision, Abaka's wound was opened and cleaned, and the Ilkhan's pain immediately subsided. This was, by the way, Nasir al-Din's final known action. He is mentioned as dying only a few years later in 1274. Even if Abaka spent more time hunting and drinking than with the day-to-day governance, it did not mean that the Ilkhanate was rudderless. Abaka had the luxury to spend time how he wanted, due to the governorship of his vizier Shams al-Din Juyvani. Shams al-Din and his brother Alal al-Din Atamalik were from a family of administrators, with both their father and grandfather officials of the Seljuk Sultans and the Khwarezm Shahs. Ala al-Din had served in the administration of Arghun Aka, the Mongol governor, for most of Western Asia from the 1240s until Hulagu's western advance, and had been held in quite some esteem by the great bureaucrat. Ala al-Din's own historical account, The History of the World Conqueror, features a lengthy and glowing biography of Arghun Aka. Arghun Aka continued in a post as the primary tax collector of the Ilkhanate throughout Abaka's reign, as well as governor of Khorasan, thereby remaining an important ally to the Juyvanis. Attached to Hulagu's camp with the start of the prince's campaign, both Juyvani brothers rose in prominence under his eye. With the establishment of the Ilkhanate, Shams al-Din was made the chief minister of the state, the vizier, and the head of the Diwan, and chief financial officer, Sahib Diwan, while Ala al-Din Atamalik was made governor of Baghdad to oversee its reconstruction. The Sahib Diwan was the head of the Ilkhanate's civilian administration, which was, to paraphrase Michael Hope's discussion on the matter in his Power, Politics, and Tradition in the Mongol Empire and Ilkhanate Iran, responsible for provisioning the army, foreign relations, the post system, royal and public treasuries, and collection of revenues. The Sahib Diwan led a group of regional assistants who coordinated these activities through the provinces of the empire, based on the traditional Persian administration, the Diwan. The Mongol edition was a sort of dual administration, wherein the regional operatives of the Sahib Diwan were under the supervision of Mongol governors who held supreme authority. So, under Abaka's reign, Ala al-Din Juyvani, the governor of Baghdad, acted as a sort of assistant or deputy to the Mongol governor of Arab Iraq, Khorasan and Fars, Sukunjak Aka. In Anatolia, Mu'in al-Din Suleiman worked alongside and under the Mongol governor, Samagar Noyan. The military elite, the Noyad, that is, the heads of the family and military leaders, generally served as intermediaries between the Diwan and the Ilkhan. The success of a given Sahib Diwan rested on his ability to maneuver and work with the Noyad. As such, the power and influence of the head of the Ilkhanate's civilian administration fluctuated wildly, often relying on connections more often than ability. Shams al-Din Juyvani was capable enough at the handling of the Noyad, though over the late 1270s found himself increasingly undermined by the Noyad and other officials. As usual, money brought a great deal of the trouble. The Juyvanis became very wealthy over their tenure. It was not simply a case of needlessly enriching themselves, as they were expected to cover many of the costs of their operations themselves, from patronizing other officials, gift-giving to bribes needed to keep things running smoothly, or supporting public projects and donations for the sake of the popular image of the empire and government. Shams al-Din Juyvani, it must be said, did seem to pay artists and poets great sums to spread good works about himself and speak of his magnificence. As with any administrator we've met in our overview of the Mongol Empire, these men made enemies, often by men who felt excluded from power and had to appoint their own trusted men and family members to high positions in order to keep these areas out of the hands of enemies, or ensure they worked in agreement with the Sahib Diwan. It had the side effect, though, of being nepotism and an easy charge for anyone to rally against. Sahib Shams al-Din found that his Diwan was quite subservient to the needs of the military and, in many respects, simply served as a means to provide for the Noyad and their troops. As long as the money kept coming in for the military needs, such as for Abaka to move and supply troops from frontier to frontier to face Jochids, Chagattayids, Kara-Unas, and Mamluks, then Abaka was usually fine to allow Shams al-Din to act autonomously. Though both Giovanni brothers had developed a kitchen cabinet of rivals and faced accusations, their positions rested secure until 1277. 1277 proved a hallmark year for Abaka, the Giovannis, and the Ilkhanate itself. That year, the Mamluk Sultan Baibars led a devastating invasion into Mongol-ruled Anatolia, defeating a large Mongol army at Elbistan, advancing as far west as Kayseri before withdrawing back to Syria, where he died that summer. The Mamluk and Ilkhanate frontier in Syria had not moved much since the immediate aftermath of Ain Jalut in 1260, but Baibars had gradually been pushing up along the coastline, attacking, harassing, and conquering the Ilkhan's allies, the Crusader states, and the Kingdom of Cilician Armenia. In 1265, following Hulegu's death, Baibars conquered Caesarea, Haifa, Arsuf, and Galilee. In 1268, Baibars took Antioch. In 1271, he took Krak de Chevalier and almost took Tripoli. When Abaka's attention was elsewhere, the Mamluk raided Cilician Armenia. In Anatolia, the Mongols ruled over the shattered remnants of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum in an administration headed by Mu'in al-Din Suleiman, better known as the Pervaneh. The Pervaneh was the dominant figure of the rump state of the Seljuks of Rum. The Seljuk Sultan, Giyath al-Din Kayhusra III, was a young boy, so the Pervaneh acted as co-governor with Samagar Noyan, his Mongolian counterpart. The two had a stable relationship, but when Abaka appointed his younger brother, Qho'Oei, to replace Samagar, the Pervaneh chafed under the increased financial burden and supervision and asked Abaka to recall his brother, claiming Qho'Oei was in cooperation with Baibars. Abaka promised to recall him, but delayed. In his frustration, the Pervaneh reached out to Baibars. The Sultan's curiosity was piqued, but didn't commit. By the time his response reached the Pervaneh in 1274, Qho'Oei and Samagar had been replaced by Tokhanoyan, and the Pervaneh didn't respond. Under Tokhanoyan, Mongol pressure was even greater in Anatolia, and the Pervaneh's powers were limited. What follows is a terrible mess of political machinations. The Pervaneh got Tokhanoyan removed, Qho'Oei was reinstated, the Pervaneh's efforts to remove Qho'Oei again frustrated Abaka, who removed Qho'Oei, killed some of his followers, and reinstated the Pervaneh and Tokhanoyan. In November 1275, the Mongols besieged Al-Bira, the major Mamluk fort on the Euphrates River in Syria, but Baibars had learned of it in advance, allegedly due to the Pervaneh. After this, the Pervaneh was careful to rebuild trust with Abaka, bringing him the Seljuk Sultan's sister to wed. At the same time, with or without the Pervaneh's support, a group of Rumi emirs met with Baibars in July 1276, urging him to attack. Judging there was enough support in Rum for him, Baibars agreed, mobilized his army over winter 1276, and set out in February 1277. The result was Baibars' devastating raid into Anatolia. Though the Pervaneh refused to meet with Baibars, staying instead in his fortress at Tokat, this did nothing to ease Abaka's fury. Abaka arrived in Anatolia swiftly with an army, but missed Baibars, and in his wrath demanded every living thing between Kayseri and Erzurum be massacred. Only with difficulty did Shams al-Din Giovanni talk the Ilkhan out of such horror, and was convinced to sate himself with only sacking the nearby city of Siwas, executing leaders of a local Turkoman tribe. When Abaka's threatened invasion of Syria could not materialize due to the summer heat, he returned to his Azerbaijani pastures and summoned the Pervaneh to him. Only reluctantly did the Pervaneh arrive on his master's bidding, where he was charged and put to death. Allegedly, his flesh was eaten by Abaka and the senior Mongols. Though Shams al-Din Giovanni was moved to Anatolia to oversee reconstruction there, Abaka's trust in his civilian officials was greatly broken. Now was the time for the enemies of the Jivanis to strike. Majid al-Mulk Yazdi, a former protege of Shams al-Din who felt wronged by him, reported that the Jivanis had been in cooperation with the Mamluks and had assisted Baibars in invading Anatolia based on words from one of Shams al-Din's deputies. Abaka had the deputy interrogated and beaten, but the man refused to condemn Shams al-Din, saving the vizier from charges. Majd al-Mulk fell out of favor and into destitution, and in an attempt to win him over, Shams al-Din donated a considerable sum of money to him. When Abaka was in Khorasan in 1280 dealing with a Kara-Una attack, Majd al-Mulk moved again. This time, he met with Abaka's son, Argun, and reporting that not only were the Jivanis still in correspondence with the Mamluks, but they were also embezzling huge amounts from the royal treasury. Claiming that Shams al-Din's donation was actually hush money to keep him quiet, Majd al-Mulk convinced Prince Argun of the treachery of the Jivanis. Argun told Abaka of it on his return from campaign, but it took until the spring of 1281 when Majd al-Mulk met with Abaka in person and reported it for Abaka to react. An angered Abaka finally moved, arresting the Jivanis and ordering their accounts investigated. Luckily for Shams al-Din, he was able to petition one of Abaka's wives, Olje Khatun, to convince Abaka of their innocence. Though Majd al-Mulk did not succeed in this attempt, he was not out of favor, and Abaka appointed him as an official Czech with Shams al-Din in a sort of co-vizier role. From this position, Majd al-Mulk focused his plots against Shams al-Din's brother, the governor of Baghdad, Ala al-Din Ata Malik Joivani, the historian. The same charges were employed, accusations of embezzlement, treachery, etc. Majd al-Mulk's timing was good, for it caught Abaka in a particularly foul mood. Late in 1281, Abaka's younger brother, Monkey Temur, had been sent with an army into Syria against the Mamluks. Abaka had been supposed to join him, but had instead wasted time hunting. While he was hunting, the inexperienced Monkey Temur suffered a humiliating defeat at Homs against the Mamluk Sultan, Kalawun. Abaka was, as you might expect, rather furious. He spent winter 1281 in Baghdad making plans himself to invade Syria. While there, Majd al-Mulk convinced upon Abaka of Ala al-Din Joivani's crimes. Ala al-Din was arrested, then freed by Abaka, then fined millions of gold pieces. Unable to pay the fines upon an audit, Majd al-Mulk had Ala al-Din beaten and dragged through the streets of Baghdad. Only Abaka's death saved him. Abaka left Baghdad at the start of 1282 and traveled to Hamadan, where he partook in that favorite Mongol princely tradition, a night of binge drinking. The following morning, he was dead, having been struck in his final moments, according to Rashid al-Din, with a vision of a blackbird perched in a tree. Ordering an archer to shoot at it, no bird could be found, but upon the realization, Abaka was dead. Abaka's nearly 20-year rule had a significant effect on the Ilkhanate, a period of consolidation and continuation from the years of his father, Hulagu. Abaka managed to keep the military and civilian government largely balanced, oversaw reconstruction after the conquests, and secured his border from powerful neighbors. Recognizing the nominal supremacy of the Great Khan, Abaka proved a formidable presence in Western Asia, and with only brief exceptions, the longevity of his reign would ensure that his family would dominate the Ilkhanate until its dissolution. Yet Abaka overlooked problems facing his kingdom, leaving his successors to deal with a proud military element that would only grow to seek more influence at the expense of the Ilkhan and the civilian administration. We will be exploring these topics and the period following Abaka's death in the next episodes, so be sure to subscribe to the Kings and Generals podcast to follow. If you enjoyed this and would like to help us continue bringing you great content, then please consider supporting us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. This episode was researched and written by our series historian, Jack Wilson. I'm your host, David, and we will catch you on the next one.